The peaceful protests continue. They continue locally, they continue throughout our nation. More incidents of people being killed at the hand of the police are continuing to make the news. People are debating the circumstances, the consequences surrounding all of this. We hear the chants and see the protests that are proclaiming that Black Lives Matter. And as we might expect, certainly I have heard from some people, the chant that rises up to sort of match the Black Lives Matter, that somehow blue lives matter. All lives matter. Underneath all of this unrest is some longing, some quest to kind of sort out who's important, who isn't. How do we set a value on a life, whether it's black, blue, or all life? We struggle with how we give importance to one group of people or to an individual here. Who is worthy of what respect and honor? These conversations fill our minds, they make our heads spin, they fill our streets with protesters longing for answers and hopeful about the future. Let me tell you a story of a man whose job it was to place value on human life. His name was Ken Feinberg. Ken Feinberg was an attorney. He was a lawyer. He was a mediator by trade. And his specialty was in managing victim compensation payouts. He was the one who sat down after the Deepwater Horizon catastrophe and began to sort out how they would pay out the victim compensation fund. He was the one who worked with the 737 MAX settlements. He was the one who was at Penn State and Sandy Hook. And he was the one who managed the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund. Billions of dollars paid out to the families of those victims. Ken Feinberg wrote that as a lawyer he knew that no two lives were worth the same. And so as the 9/11 money made its way to the families of victims, those blue-collar folk who did some of the menial work, the custodians, the parking attendants, the union blue-collar people, they received some compensation. The smallest amount paid out was $250,000. The top executives, the fund managers, the heads of brokerage houses were paid in excess of $7 million. No two lives were worth the same, according to Ken. Jesus in the gospel today talks about hard times. He talks about conflict. He talks about difficulty and separation, which was going to come our way, which would be part of our discipleship. He told us, he tried to prepare us for taking up the cross. And then in the midst of all of that, Jesus speaks of the smallest, most insignificant creatures, sparrows. Sparrows. Not one of those birds falls from the air without God knowing. Sparrows, the cheapest, most meager meat available to one in the marketplace of Jesus' day. Even their lives, of these small and seemingly insignificant birds, are not beneath God's attention. So powerful were these words of hope, these words of good news, that Sevilla Martin wrote a song called "His Eye is on the Sparrow," which has been a mainstay in African American faith communities for years. Right now, today, we live in a culture that has a heightened awareness that Black lives matter. Our protesters, our news outlets, our citizens rise up and cry out that Black lives matter in a world that insists on placing value on human life, some higher than others. But Jesus declares in the midst of that, just as he turned our attention to the sparrows, Jesus declares that the overlooked, the exploited, the brutalized are of the greatest importance in a world where the rich seem to be worth 28 times more than the lowly employee. Jesus Christ in the gospel today pays attention to the poor, the struggling, the suffering. Human beings have value, not because of how much we earn, or where we went to school, or what zip code we live in. But we find value because we have been created in the image of God, and we have the promise from Jesus himself that we will not be alone. And when Jesus dies on the cross, he dies on that cross showing us the amazing sacrifice that God is willing to make for us, for you. It says the Son of God will surrender everything for you. You are as valuable in God's eyes as his own Son. Love for the neighbor, love for creation, pushes us in a direction where we express that through our sacrifice and compassion. The value that we place on others does not lead to compensation or even to safety. It means that we get God's attention. Nothing stands outside of the circle of God's care. And ultimately, we cannot know our value until we recognize value in our neighbor. When we prepare, as Jesus has asked us to, when we prepare to take up our cross, when we prepare to love our neighbor, what we are saying is that the sacrifices that we make, the things that we are willing to generously share and give, are the reflection of the value of the neighbor. You are saying your neighbor is valued when you take up your cross and show love for the neighbor. Let me say one more word about Ken Feinberg. His struggles to place value on human life weighed heavily on his heart. After the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund had been administered, Ken went on to direct the work of the Hokie Spirit Memorial Fund. If you're not sure what a Hokie is, Ken went on to administer the fund at Virginia Tech after the shootings there. Feinberg wrote at that point that the human Feinberg came into conflict with the lawyer Feinberg. And as he worked with that fund, all the victims, the students, the faculty, the PhDs, they all received the same compensation. In a transformed life, a life transformed by learning the value of our life and our neighbor's life through the cross, we can't help but be made new. We can't help but look at our neighbor with renewed, loving, compassionate eyes, because we know that in God's sight, there are no unimportant